Calling Up Bones, a Mage the Awakening story. Cyprian sat in the dark of his chamber, his eyes closed and his thin lips moving as he mouthed the words of his incantation. He breathed deeply, coils of incense smoke filling his nostrils with their dry, acrid scent. It made him think of funerals, of the perfumed, polished wood that was never enough to truly hide the smell of a corpse when one leaned over the casket to say their goodbyes. He focused his thoughts, moving his fingertips across the small collection of objects spread out before him. A tie pin, a plain gold wedding band, an empty shell casing, and an old jackknife. Each of them had belonged to one of his men, and each of them had been marked by blood and a binding. He had felt the change in these items, and the alteration of their state had woken him from a deep, dead sleep. "David Alberto," Cyprian said, speaking the name clearly as he opened his sight and touched the old wedding ring that, to the necromancer's mystical gaze, bore the scars and tumors of an old love that had become a cancer. "Arise." Something in the shape of a man answered Cyprian's command. Tall and angular, with a gaunt face that had once been handsome, the ghostly figure was still dressed in a casual jacket and jeans. It smelled of blood and cordite, and one of its eyes was gone, replaced by a ghastly hole that tunneled all the way through to the back of its skull. The ghost seemed confused, but there was recognition on the spirit's face right away when it saw Cyprian. "Boss?" it said, forehead furrowing. Cyprian raised 2 fingers. "Did you do what I sent you to do?" "We found him," the spirit said. Its voice was far away and confused. That was to be expected. He hadn't been dead long, and he had probably gone through one hell of a journey to snap back all the way here to the center of the country. "We shot him. I know we did. I saw him go down before... Boss, I saw his gun go off right in my face." Cyprian waved his hand, and the spirit went silent as surely as if the necromancer had hung up a phone. He repeated the ritual with each of the other objects in turn, calling forth the newly dead men who'd been bound to them. Eddie Vance, who had a fist-size hole in the middle of his chest. Carl Curly Lenaro, who was missing half of his big bald head. The last one was Bobby Ballerini, barely old enough to drop out of college, who had the lean, hungry look of a half-starved wolf. It was made a lot worse by the mess of blood and guts dripping out of his stomach from where the bullets had torn open his belly. "Did you do what I sent you to do?" Cyprian asked. The spirit shook his head, his eyes glimmering pinpricks of light. "No, boss," he said. "Johnny went down, but he got us. All of us. He was dying, but then something came to him." Cyprian stopped, the muscles of his jaw flexing. When he spoke, his voice was tight. "What came to him?" "I couldn't see it too good," Bobby said. "It looked like a man, but it wasn't right. Thing had a face like a gun and smelled like blood." Cyprian frowned at that, a deep crease of consternation furrowing his forehead. He had his mouth open to ask another question when there was a knock at the door of his chamber. He blinked and lost his grip on his sight. The darkness of the room closed in and the spirit standing before him vanished. He was left in a small, dark room with smoke clawing at his throat. He coughed, putting both hands over his mouth. "Boss, you in there?" Phil said from outside. "Tony, you okay?" Getting to his feet, still coughing, Tony Gracchus shuffled to the door and opened it. Standing there in the moonlight, he was a short man with greasy black hair that framed his round face. He wore a thick goatee and mustache, but there was still a boyish quality to him that he just couldn't hide. Jamming his soft hands into the pockets of his bathrobe, he looked up at Phil. Phil wasn't his bodyguard. Not exactly, but he was the house muscle, and whenever something went down, it was Phil's job to see to it. Even if he was still in his pajamas, like he was now. "I'm fine, Phil," Tony said, waving away the last of the incense smoke that oozed out of the walk-in closet he used as his ritual space. "The hell you doing banging down my door? Didn't I tell you not to disturb me when I'm in here?"
"I know, boss. I'm sorry, but it's important," Phil said.
"You got a call from Philly?" Tony asked. The look on Phil's face said Tony was right, and he indulged himself in a nasty little smile. "Let me guess. Cops picked up our boys?"
"Yeah, them in the meat wagon,"
Phil said, the shock on his face replaced by a kind of resignation. He shook his head once.
4 wasn't enough. Looks like Johnny's still got it."
"It was almost enough," Tony said under his breath.
"Boss?"
Phil asked. Tony waved a hand and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Nothing," he said. "Look, it's still early. Make calls after everybody's had coffee. Nobody needs to wake up for this."
"Right,"
Phil said, nodding. He licked his lips and swallowed, rubbing at his nose.
"You, want me to task another crew, boss?"
"No," Tony said, shaking his head. Tony, who was known to those in the community of the Awakened as Cyprian, stepped back into his ritual space. "Don't worry about it, Phil. I'll get this handled." Cyprian closed the closet door and listened until he heard Phil step back into the hallway. Taking a deep breath of the dead air in the room, Cyprian focused. Johnny Hammer had been a nobody before tonight, a one-time trigger man just blowing in the breeze. Taking him out had been nothing more than a piece of routine maintenance, but now it looked like Johnny had the potential to be a problem not just for Tony Gracchus, but for Cyprian as well.